real obvious.
And so you read a lot of business books, right? You're an entrepreneur. Mm-hmm. You run a very successful business here in North Las Vegas. And then you have other entrepreneurial interests beyond your core business. So do you only read business books, or do you take time to do some non-business stuff?
I've made a pretty good switch about 3/4 of the way through last year to get away from a lot of the business books and self-help books. I found I still really like to read like The Four, where it's more of a biography type of thing, where it's stories about a successful company, or the 10 ways to do this and the 6 ways to do that. I've kind of really stayed away from that stuff because it gets really old. Yeah, it's just people regurgitating information that we all already know.
And do you feel like I could write this, or I've read this
already 3
times?
To the point where maybe I could have wrote it better than they did. So yeah, I switched over to. I'm a big outdoorsman. I like all kinds of outdoor sports and being in the wild and camping and fishing, hunting. So I've changed to a lot of older conservation stories, like 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s type stuff. When we decided that it was time to start managing game and putting public lands aside and doing a lot of conservation work. So I'm reading a lot of stuff.
So what are some of those titles?
So my favorite one out of that, there's a guy called Dick Prenneke. And he had a PBS special for a long time, so some people might have seen the videos. He went off in the early 60s, I believe, and he went off to Alaska, got dropped off with a few bags and his video recorder, and this is way before my time, so I don't know what kind of 35 millimeter or whatever, I don't know, whatever the old video cameras were. And he basically got dropped off in the middle of nowhere. No neighbors, no nothing, like nothing at all within walking or boating distance.
Right.
Built a cabin by hand with just tools that he brought. Built all of his silverware and utensils and all that stuff. And he wasn't like a lunatic trying to live off the grid. We weren't at that point back then. He just wanted to go and be out in nature and record nature in its natural state and whatever. So this guy, he basically goes through his daily life. So somebody wrote his diary out. And this was like one of the most positive books I've ever read, and gave me just a totally new outlook on everyday life.
All right, so now I'm not an outdoorsman. I'm not a hunter. The idea of getting dropped... If I got dropped off in Alaska like that...
the last thing you're going to do is write a book,
It would end badly, but it would be very quick. But you appreciate that kind of stuff. If you're a non-outdoorsman, would you appreciate the messaging in the book, or do you have to be...
I think so, because the message goes way past any of those hobbies and stuff. It's more of just simplifying his life, right? So he took all this other nonsense out of his life, and his problem for the day was like if the squirrel was going to come and invade his kitchen. But this guy was so happy being out there without the distractions and all this other negativity in his life,
right,
that he wouldn't talk bad about anything. Like, well, I woke up to another 7 feet of snow, so it looks like I'm stuck inside today. But on the bright side, I'll have time to catch up on whittling or this or that. Like, it was nothing negative. I mean,
so it sort of seems to tie into the zebra book because I'm still a Northeasterner, and so we deal with snow, and you driven a lot by the media is, oh, it's going to snow. Am I going to be able to keep my meetings? Am I going to be able to go to work? And my employees are going to be? Will the kids' game get canceled? And I got to plow the driveway, and none of that really matters that much. So I have one that's related. I have a few books I read last year that are non-business related, and I agree with you. The self-help genre is kind of worn out for me. It's done wonders for me. Huge fan of it, but I don't know. I just been there, done that a little bit. But I do love human interest stories, and I like history where you can learn from it, and it has business applications. It has relational skills that you could draw from it. But the book that I have that's related to you is a book called Stranger in the Woods. Mm-hmm. The author is Finkel. And candidly, nobody recommended it to me. But I was in the library. I actually read this one. I was in the library, and at the end of the aisles, they'll have displays, and it caught my attention. But the long and short of it is this young man in Maine back in the mid-1980s. Back in the mid-1980s, normal upbringing, no trauma. He leaves his car in the woods of Maine, and he doesn't come out for like 36 years. He just lives in the woods in Maine. And it appears that he didn't speak to anybody for all these years. so it's a neat book. And what's cool about it, when I first started reading it, it seemed like, oh, neat, this like weird guy doesn't want to be with people, this, that, the other thing. But the book really goes into a lot of why you need people, relationships, and this guy was perfectly content not talking to anybody. He didn't dislike people, he didn't have a problem with people, but he was just super content. Now, the funny thing is he was living off the land by stealing from people's seasonal cabins, and eventually he got caught, went to the well too often. But once he got put in the system, he got put back into society, he couldn't live in the woods, and he wasn't happy. Mm-hmm. So it's a pretty good book.
I'll check it out.
And then another one I have, you're former military, served U.S. Air Force. Mm-hmm. Have you heard of the book Devotion?
Yes.
Did you read it?
Yep, not yet. No.
Oh my God, it's amazing.
Is it good? Good.
So unbelievably good. Probably the best book I've read last year. It doesn't have the business impact or the macro view that the 4 gives you about the world and what's happening, but it's so good. The central character and the central story in that book is unbelievably powerful. And I bet you they make it into a movie too. It's very, very good. That author actually has another book called A Higher Call, which is really good. That's a World War II era book. Devotion is Korean War. But that's who told you about Devotion?
I heard about it. I think I read it was one of my highlights that when they kind of suggest books for you and stuff. Mm-hmm. That was one of the ones that showed up.
All right, and I understand that you sometimes will reread some books that are classics, or at least books that really you're close with and had an important role to play in your life. So have you reread anything recently?
I giggled a little bit when you said classics, because God forbid my high school English teachers are listening.
Yeah.
I still haven't read the actual classics, to be honest with you. I watched a bunch of the movies and read some cliff notes.
You didn't reread Shakespeare
no.
or The Grapes of Wrath?
But some for me, yeah. There's some that really... you get to a point where you can read a book and it might not even be the content of the book that's helping you do something, but an idea that you get that's sparked because of the subject you're reading on or whatever. So some of those for me that I've reread, I bet you I've reread each one of these books at least 5 times. And these are all books that I actually physically read years ago. And then now I listen to them over and over. But yeah, I bet you this year I've probably listened to each of these 3 or 4 times. And I know I've read them 3 or 4 times each. But Dale Carnegie, How to Win Friends and Influence People.
All right.
I can't get a lot of people to like that book because it's old school. Because it's like, who is this guy? You're going to listen to this 90-year-old guy who was already outdated at the time.
Yeah, he was already old when that came.
Yeah, he was already old when it came out, and the book came out 100 years ago. What are you doing? It's the principles behind it, and it still works today. Obviously, you got to change the lingo a little bit, but think of the different outcomes you get when you go in, you get bad service somewhere, and you go in and start throwing a fit and raising your hands and doing whatever and screaming and yelling, versus, hey, how you doing today? These 3 things were really good, but I wanted to talk to you a little bit about this bad thing that happened and see what we can do to improve it, whatever. That positive attitude makes a huge difference. Mm-hmm. So I'm on both sides of that counter a lot, right? Okay. As a customer and as a business owner. Mm-hmm. So as a business owner, I would go 100 times out of my way if you have a problem with my product, period, no matter what, right? I'll go an extra 100 times if you're not an ass about it. If you come to me and you just explain, hey,
sure,
stuff happens. This happened. We don't know why yet. Let's figure out why. I'm not going to accuse you of anything. You're not going to accuse me of anything. And we're going to just work out the problem. So just having a positive attitude, being friendly to people, getting what you want.
All right.
Basically. Maybe it's a selfish reason, but it's being a better person to make sure you're getting what you want out of people.
All right. What else do you reread?
So that's one of them. The other one is 4-Hour Workweek. Same thing.
That's one of my favorites, and I reread that.
That was one that you actually sent me years ago, 5 or 6, 7 years ago. I bet you sent me that book, and I read it. And at the time, it was more of a fantasy than anything. But the more and more that I read it, it's the same thing. I know the book by heart now, but it sparks ideas on how I can do more with automation, more automating. Hey, something we try to do here is every 6 months we go through and I talk to the girls in the office that are dealing with the customers, and they're the ones reading the 300, 400 emails a day. And we try to say, okay, we've automated all these processes. If a customer wants this information, we've done it to where you don't have to do a lot of work. What's the next thing down that list? What is the most common thing you deal with? And how do we make it a more automated process? And how do we do this stuff so we can kind of all free up more time to do different things?
I understand what you're saying. So you read the book, and some of it's applicable, some of it's not. Some of Tim Ferriss, the author's ideas are extreme, and not everyone can adopt everything. I think that's fantastical. It seems to me that Tim Ferriss hasn't even adopted everything in his own book. But when you read that, you get your creative juices flowing on how you can manage your time, how you could leverage technology, how you could be more efficient, how you could cut out time wasters, the things that exhaust you that are not important. So that's good. I reread that book regularly also. I know we joked before about The Gifted Boss, but I reread that book regularly. And that's similar to the book I think you described. It's an easy read. I mean, you could bang that out in 1 or 2 sittings easily. What are a couple of the others that you reread?
Another one that I caught myself reading 3 times, I think, already this year, and I read it once in 17 and 3 times in 18, was called The Power of Habit.
Okay.
And it's a newer book, but it's another one that's just so obvious that it just sparks something inside you. There's no new principles in there. It talks about exactly what it says, the power of habit. If you can take some bad habits and turn them into good habits. A lot of people talk about, well, I'm going to break this habit, or my New Year's resolution is going to be this, but they never make a plan. They never set a goal. They don't do anything to replace it. So quitting smoking is one. I smoked for a long time. Decades. And next week will be my 1-year anniversary without a single step up, no going back at all, no desire to go back, but it was one of those things where I was just replacing it. So they're saying there's a bunch of medical studies in there and psychoanalyst stuff, and a lot of it is basically you cannot get rid of a bad habit. Your bad habit will always be there. You have to replace it with something else and train yourself to know that when it's time for that bad habit, it's something else. It's not that anymore. And I found that to be true with a whole bunch of stuff, and it's helped me in my daily life basically make time for the things that are more important now as I grow a family and whatever, and putting that first. So most of the time I try to before my business. But part of that habit was, talking about a good daily structure. And no, this is your time. If your time in the morning is to go to the gym for an hour and then make breakfast with your kids, then that's your time, and don't cross that line. If it's not an emergency, don't cross that line. Make that your habit and do it and respect it. Beautiful. And then you start business afterwards.
So as we begin to wind down, time flew by. Any books that you could point to that you're anxious to read? I know I'm going to be reading the 21 Lessons for the 21st Century by Harari. It's highly recommended to me. I don't know, have you heard of that?
Not yet.
I don't really know much about it, but that's next up. And that's more of a business book. I don't know about you. I try and do different genres. Otherwise, they kind of blur together. So if I read like a finance book, then the next one won't be a finance book. But if I read history books back to back, then I'll start confusing Civil War with World War II. So
that's definitely something I've been trying to do as well. So yeah, mine this year, the Just for Fun, and it's probably boring to a lot of people. I want to read the transcripts of the Lewis and Clark diaries.
Okay.
And it's long. It's 60 hours or 60 or 70 hours.
Is that a book?
It's several series of books, yeah. So there's been books on it. There's been books like condensed version, Cliff Notes versions. Sure. But these are the actual transcripts of the diaries, read word for word.
So listeners, I would not recommend you read the Lewis and Clark diaries.
So no, I'm kind of excited. I like that kind of stuff, the frontiersmen and how things were settled and the way it was back then. And hearing their description of, you got to remember, like, they came out west and they're describing things that nobody has ever seen before. Animals, elk, stuff like that, like stuff that they don't have names. Nobody knows. So to listen to them, I think that's kind of cool. And then my next business one on the chopping block is Shoe Dog.
Yeah, I read that. Yeah, I read that actually last year.
Is it worth keeping on my list?
It is. It's very good. But it's like you said, it's not heavy on business. It's more a little history about how Nike became the powerhouse it is. It's a little business because you learn some of the things that he did well and some of the mistakes that Phil Knight had starting, building, and growing the company. But it's mostly just a human interest story, and it's not terribly